Let us begin this day, as always, mindful of how much we live and move and have our being in God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord, we pray that the Blessed Mother wrap her mantle around your priests, seminarians, religious, and deacons, and through her intercession strengthen them for their ministry. We pray that Mary will guide your priests, seminarians, religious, and deacons to follow her own words. Do whatever he tells you. Gracious and loving God, we come before you this day as we conclude this time together. May your servants have the heart of Joseph, Mary's chaste spouse. May the Blessed Mother's own pierced heart inspire us to embrace all who suffer at the foot of the cross. May your priests, seminarians, religious, and deacons be holy, filled with the fire of your love, seeking nothing but your greater glory and the salvation of souls. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. John Vianney, pray for us. As we conclude this conference in honor of the wonderful year for priests that Benedict XVI has given us, what an appropriate way for us to end, isn't it? That we spend so much time together as colleagues, collaborators, in this incredible ministry. I think I speak not only for those of us at St. John Vianney, but I certainly speak for the staff here at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, that it has been a privilege and honor to be able to walk with you this week. What a great grace. What a truly great grace for us to be mindful of and for us to really walk in. That grace is both gift of God and also of nature. That your response to this week has allowed that grace to come forth. And so I am particularly humbled by your responsiveness to the week and what we put you through. I don't know about you, but I am tired. But I want to thank, most especially in the back there, Monsignor Joe Pryor again for your hospitality and for your graciousness and opening up all of this to us and your leadership, Joe, throughout these many years to the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and to really allowing this to really take hold and take root. We've already seen much fruit in the Psychologists meeting already this morning in ways that we hope will continue this collaboration. So I'd like to acknowledge, if we could, by applause, to you, Joe, and to the seminary for your hosting us. He did his doctoral dissertation on the personality structure of Mexican and Mexican Americans, and now published in the Journal of Research and Personality. He's published dozens of articles in peer-reviewed journals: the Journal of Personality, Social Psychology, Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, Journal of Individual Differences, and has taught personality assessment at the graduate level and doctoral programs in clinical psychology and at my alma mater in the wonderful city of San Diego, California, which I want on tape with my provincial. I fully intend to return to San Diego. And has been involved for 10 years in extensive international cross-cultural research projects investigating personality and culture in 7 different countries. This research is currently funded by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, which are incredibly prestigious grant funding authorities. He himself is a former seminarian of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and familiar with seminary formation and experienced evaluations, an experienced evaluator with counseling seminarians and clergy, and currently is the director of, co-director of the counseling center at that wonderful powerhouse of basketball power of the Northwest of Gonzaga University. And so I welcome him, and I ask you to welcome him to our discussion this morning. I'll never listen to Steve Doherty again. Where is Steve? When he suggested that, well, gee, Jerry, let's have this conference, and then, you know, you and Fernando could just summarize things at the end as we go along. So we were up till 11:30 last night, you know, doing this summary, which kept me up till 2:30 because I kept thinking about it. There are some brief caveats that I want to begin with. First, what we are attempting to do here is very simple. We'll have the same format, by the way. We will speak for 40 minutes, have a Q&A period, break for 10 minutes, and then come back. And then we'll end by, again, 11:10 so that we can go to Mass. This is meant to be a brief synthesis so that what you will hear, you'll hear tonal notes of every presentation, that we've had prior to this. So we will go back to the keynotes of Archbishop Miller and Len Sperry all throughout. We will throw a lot of information on your plate, and we've given you, has everybody gotten the handouts? Because we have the handouts of the PowerPoint slides. Anybody not get the handouts, please raise your hand. Okay, Pat, could you make sure that the people who have raised their hands get the handouts so you have something to write on? And just keep your hands up as Pat hands them out to you. We have some folks down here, and then there's some folks back in the breakout room there. One of the issues that we're extremely concerned about as we sort of looked back on the week are two caveats that we really want you to write down and be very careful about. As psychologists, we're trained how to put proper boundaries between ourselves and our clients and what to do with psychological issues. My sense is we need no other conference as to how to teach vocation directors and formation personnel how to do the same thing. My concern for you as you leave here is that you practice a very simple technique. And that technique is this. Prior to any encounter with an individual, notice what you're feeling. Note that feeling, at least mentally or on paper, and notice what you're feeling when you're with the individual. 10 to 1, that feeling will be different, and that feeling or affective experience that you then have with the individual is not what you're feeling in that interaction, but might be information about what might the person you're with be feeling. At the end of that encounter, contain it, either in your mind or in writing it down. Important data. Particularly important for vocation directors who screen and have a portal capacity, right, to screen out pathology before it ever gets to the admission committee. But you're out there alone doing that. I worry, therefore, about you. Because you will meet pathology and evil head on. And let's be very clear about incorporating both aspects of this. From the very beginning, I think what we've done from our scheduling is to incorporate both the psychological and spiritual realities. Don't forget about both. Good Catholic psychology and good Catholic theology is always a both and. Likewise, with the formational personnel, you also have an additional problem. Because not only are you going to be aware of what you might be feeling with that person who might be struggling or depressed or anxious or highly sort of in a hypervigilant state, but you have to live with them often, don't you? Is that an amen from the congregation? So where do you get support? How do you maintain boundaries? How do you maintain your own sense of team so that you're not divided by the psychology and the psychological issues that might in and of themselves be divisive, which points to the pathology, not to your inadequacy as a team. Your need to consult, your need to put security around yourselves and your team is paramount as we begin this discussion and in your ministry as you leave here. Be extremely careful about those issues. Another caveat, watch the numbers push. In a church that is struggling for vocations, there is a systemic undercurrent that we must get vocations at any price. Never, ever substitute quantity for quality. Finally, there is new data that is clear to me, having done the majority of my occupation at this point is to be present to dioceses and to religious orders throughout the country. There is little question, and this is an article that Fernando and I have literally penned and is in submission, that we are seeing a consistent problem with the newly ordained across dioceses throughout the country and religious orders. In the first 5 years after ordination, we are seeing a significant uptick in severe psychological and or sexual misconduct problems, to the tune of almost consistently now in several major dioceses, to the tune of almost 20 to 25% of newly ordained clergy. I posed a question for you for hopefully for the next conference, but also for you as you return to go back to your system, to go back to your diocese, to go back to your religious institute with the question, gee, I just heard this bit of data. What part of our system, what part of our seminary, what part of what we're doing could be part of the solution? Notice how I phrased that. What single thing, what small thing might we be looking for that might stop the submarining through our formation and seminary processes? So those are the caveats. Submarining, of course, is, I hope you understand the term, that individuals, because of the high impression management is a very specific term, the people who are in situations that are highly social desirable, i.e., that I should present good in a seminary, and they do, they fake good, in that pressurized situation that Len Sperry was talking about. Is it the apple or is it the barrel? I want that image to be with you throughout this presentation. Or is it the combination? Those are three distinct realities we see in social psychology. Let me say that again. This is critically important that you get this concept. Is it the apple? Is it the barrel? Is it the combination of the apple and the barrel? Does that make sense? Because that, to me, gives us hope as possible means of intervention. All right? We know in research, and have known for 20 years in research, that it's often the combination where the variance will be, where the interventions need to be conceived of. If your interventions, and this is the big caveat, if your interventions are typically, which is what we will do because we always commit the fundamental attributional error, are typically on the personality level, you're missing the point. I.e., it's his problem. It's Sam, isn't it? All right, and we're going to be talking about Sam in a minute. If that's the intervention, you're missing the point. And I think that's what we're seeing in the numbers. It would be my basic hypothesis. I would predict that that's what we're seeing. So those are the caveats of what we talked about before we actually then, talked about how to summarize this. And so I'm going to give Fernando then this mic, and we're going to engage in a conversation. Oh, okay, leave it here. Great.
So you have it on the slide, some of the specific objectives and the format for the lecture. Some of the feedback that we got from all of you is that sometimes we're rushing through the presentations and so forth, and we have included 3 very specific objectives. What you are going to see as we go through the presentation is some general psychological and vocational principles that are going to guide the assessment process, and also the collaboration between formators and psychologists. And also, we are going to emphasize some of the opportunities and challenges that we see and encounter as we go through that collaboration. And we have included also a visual format that illustrates the various steps and challenges of that collaboration. And so the format of the presentation goes like this. First, we wanted to ground the presentation on some research findings, and we are going to make reference to the CARA report, specifically to what are some of the concerns that were mentioned by psychologists in their collaboration with formators. And then we are going to basically go into the psychological principles, and we have included a conceptual model which is relational, that brings together some of the perspectives from psychology and also from formation. And we have derived some anthropological principles from that conceptual model. And finally, we are going to include a format that basically goes step by step, emphasizing some of the tasks, some of the challenges, and things that we do in that collaboration.
Okay. The CARA research findings, what they point to are these issues, that the need for uniformity and consistency of protocol across religious institutes and seminaries. You know, why is that important? It's important because then clear expectations and guidelines, you know, need to be articulated from you, the vocation director and the formator, in order for the protocol to have any value whatsoever. And if you're not engaged in a relationship prior to that happening, you're not going to have a clear set of specific questions. Psychological mindedness is key of the admissions committee. Anything you can do to enhance that psychological mindedness. Likewise, you're very familiar with formational terminology. You may not be familiar with psychological terminology that's going to be thrown at you in the report. One of the key things that really is, that came out of the suggestions, that is from the psychologists in particular, who feel like they're sort of swimming upstream, is to have a list of terms and language, you know, sort of variables, because oftentimes we'll use language like Vickers and, you know, internal form and external form, and we'll just expect the psychologist to know that. Terribly unfair in a relationship of two cultures. You know, that we need an ecclesiastical and religious mindedness of the psychologist to be rooted in a Catholic anthropology, that you might engage your psychologist now in a very different way. As a courtesy to candidates, one of the themes that clearly comes through in the Vatican document, clearly came through in Archbishop Miller's comments, is how do you respect the individual autonomy of that person and the sacredness of that individual? Point blank. The key thing is, it would be absolute travesty if the initial admission process was left in a closet. In other words, use the assessment as a sign of strengths and weaknesses in the formational process itself. That demands, however, that the psychologist be very clear about what are the strengths and areas of growth that they see as forthcoming. And the other thing is that we need to develop solid norms on this particular subculture.
As a psychologist, some of the psychological principles that are going to guide, once again, that interaction and collaboration, as well as the assessment process, is that I'm going to make sure that I adhere to some of the ethical principles outlined by the American Psychological Association. Of foremost importance is consent and confidentiality. In the case of consent, basically, we want to make sure that the candidate is fully informed of the assessment process and the implications of this. And for example, if you were to create a consent form, as you review this with the candidate, you can include, for example, what type of psychological evaluation is going to be conducted, and to what type of psychological evaluation is the candidate agreeing to, and also the procedures that are going to be followed, the type of report, who is going to be the recipient of this information, how is that information going to be stored and kept, once again, in confidentiality. As a psychologist, what are my obligations to this person, this client or candidate, and also my obligations and ethical professional responsibilities to the church or the seminary. And finally, giving the opportunity to the candidate to either stop or withdraw the assessment process and have access to any information that was obtained. And once again, we want to highlight all of these ethical guidelines and principles are consistent with a Catholic anthropology that respects the rights of the individual, in this case, the candidate. There is always the possibility that psychological records that contain a lot of confidential information can be casually filed or lost or misplaced, and that would be a violation or breach of some of these principles. And also, the assessment is going to take place in the context of a relationship. It's not like the candidate just comes and you administer the instruments. It's very optimal for us as psychologists to foster that relationship with the candidate and then to use a multi-method approach in the way that we derive information and the way that we come to conclusions, and that we always operate out of our scope of competence and expertise, not only in selecting the instruments, but also in interpreting all of those psychological findings.
So too, just as psychologists work out of basic principles and code of ethics, maybe we'd like to propose vocational code of ethics for vocation directors and formators. What might that look like? First and foremost, taking our lead from the Vatican document. Two things clearly stand out from the Vatican document. First of all, suitability. What are the aspects of suitability in the vocational principle? So if we take our lead, which is really, it's a beautiful and rich document, and in that document hinges on one aspect and another aspect. The first aspect being suitability runs throughout that document. What are the aspects of suitability? The second part, which is really key, as you'll see in our model, is respecting the fact that this is of God, that this is a graced event, that this is vocational discernment, and that is in and of itself not a static event, but a dynamic process from beginning to end and back again, as you'll see in the model that we propose. If we conceive of vocation to be the Pauline experience of falling off his horse and being blinded as a single event in Paul, we miss Paul, don't we? So too in your candidate who comes to you. Realize the nascent aspects of vocation at the beginning stages, and then the formational aspects of vocation as that develops, and as celibacy is known and developed. What is your model? And this is a question for another conference, clearly, but let's ask the question now. What is your model of celibate, healthy development? And is it linked to healthy sexuality? It is always linked in the Vatican document, in the sine qua non of the Vatican document, in the freedom and choice of the candidate, that we respect confidentiality, that we respect autonomy and freedom, that it's always in relationship to either the religious institute or the diocese to which the candidate is applying. The candidate doesn't just come clear out of the blue. The candidate's already been formed by a faith experience that then leads them to our stoop. And do we respect that formation experience as much as our own? And how do we incorporate that formational experience into our assessment and into our respect? What is our multi-method of gathering information besides the confirmation and baptismal certificates? What other collateral data are there that we're not tapping? Such as reviews of parishioners who work with this person, such as reviews of employees who've worked with them at a sort of placement, such as all the things we do later down the line really well. We're not tapping the people of God, who are wonderful observers of behavior. And wouldn't it be a great source of information to use that multi-method in the context of that relationship that then dictates your decision as a vocation director that you're in relationship with Fernando and I, that I as the vocation director or formator then take that to Fernando to say, this is what I'm learning, what are you learning? Notice the image. This is what we're learning. This is no conclusion we're making about the person. All right? Watch also the unconscious biases that you may unintentionally give off to the psychologist. This is the best person I've seen in years. He was Jesuit educated. He went to Georgetown. Oh my God, he's got that Norbertine tradition. Oh my word, he's from North Philly. You know, oh, this one's going to be a problem. The subtle comments that you may give that bias immediately the psychologist, and you may not be aware of how you're biasing them. How are you qualified to do this? What training are you engaging in an ongoing basis? What are your areas of expertise and competence that allow you to stand in a very privileged position, an incredibly valuable position in the church?
As a psychologist who is about to do an assessment with this candidate, I'm going to be very attentive, and I will monitor some of those biases that might get into the assessment process. And some of those biases are going to be based on some of those comments that he just made about the candidate. So we have now outlined some of the fundamental principles, both psychological and vocational, that are going to inform the collaboration. And so now what we have done basically, okay, we have synthesized a lot of the insights that you gave us during the conversations. There was a lot of information, and so we have provided you with a step-by-step format that captures some of the main insights, observations, and commentaries that we got from the conversations. And we have attached at the very end of your PowerPoint presentation handout this slide, slide number 8, so that you're able to see all of the various steps we are going to go through right now. And so this basic framework has first the pre-assessment, that is any pre-interview or pre-meeting data that we're collecting, any impressions that I'm getting from the seminary or the formators. And then the next step, which is phase 1, includes the initial data collection that happens during the clinical and behavioral interview, and then the process that I engage in as a psychologist, developing inferences, the hypothesis generating, and the very scientific and professional process that I'm going to follow as I come to conclusions and the various psychological findings about the candidate. And then, once we have all of this data and observations, we have also included the relational model that is going to help you as a psychologist conceptualize all of these findings, founded on a Catholic anthropology that includes vocational and psychological perspectives, and then how we also include some of those situational variables, referring to Dr. Sperry, avoiding the attribution error, and finally, how we write the report in a way that is accurate, that is helpful to the formators, and finally, the feedback that we give to the formation team and the candidate. Phase 1 on the framework, the pre-data collection, we all talked about how it is crucial that first we develop a professional relationship with seminary formators. As a psychologist, for example, it is advisable that we become familiar with the seminary setting and the seminary formation program. And that is going to be crucial. That is a fundamental piece of information here. And as I go about with that collaboration And specifically that I talk about the assessment and the implications. For example, that I specify the type and length of assessment, that I make financial arrangements, and that I talk about the overall working relationship between formators and psychologists. And as a psychologist, that I become familiar with vocational practices, and that I understand also the limitations of my professional competence in assessing this candidate. That, once again, is very consistent with our code of ethics, that I talk about and clarify the confidentiality and its limitations, that I obtain the consent from the applicant, ideally in a written and verbal format, and that I obtain, assess, and review collateral data that is provided to me by the formator. And that throughout the process, I conceptualize this collaboration as something that is going to be ongoing. So there's going to be that sort of iterative process going back and forth. And that when I meet with the candidate, the next one, so when I meet with a candidate, that I use active listening to clarify any understanding or misunderstandings that the candidate may have, that I listen attentively and respectfully to any areas of concern. Once again, highlighting that respect for the autonomy, the freedom, and the rights of the candidate.
And so continuing then with phase one, vocational principles that might be operational in the pre-data collection. How do I invite the psychologist into my world? That's the question in this phase. How do I let the psychologist know literally where we live? What does it look like? What's our language? It's almost, one of the things we were talking about, saying it might be an unconscious form of resistance that we haven't really taught psychologists our own language. Isn't that interesting sort of observation, saying, might we sort of be resistant from these psychologists coming into our home, but yet at the same time, how do we engage in a collaborative relationship unless we know how to speak the same language? And that's clear through the Carroll report, that language and use of terms has been just a critical aspect of that. And how we need to watch our own sort of sense of active and conscious participation of the candidate in the assessment process. That if it is a true discernment, as the document clearly states, how do we allow the discernment to be processed? How do we listen to the candidate's expectations and therefore have those expectations inform how we treat the candidate? Know the candidate's perceptions of the psychologist or the psychological assessment itself. There might be candidates who've had a bad experience with psychology growing up. One of the key questions we would ask vocational directors and formators to ask prior to this is, what has been your experience with other therapists in your family? In order for us to better assess, is there already a negative stigmatism? Is there already something negative in their family background or experiential background that they might fear would be reoccurring? Would we be re-traumatizing the individual by forcing him to do this? Know the candidate's perception, prepare the candidate for the initial interview. One of the things we talked about yesterday with psychologists was that we're asking invasive questions. Did you prepare the candidate for the fact that these are the sexual questions that will be asked, that it will be very forthright? Did you prepare the candidate for a full family disclosure? Did you prepare the candidate in all the ways? That, I think, is the wisdom of the Vatican statement in saying that's informed consent. That, that it's also part of the way in which you build the trust, and a critical way in which we can look at that. One of the sort of things that, again, I want to come back to is, how do you build that relationship with the psychologist? So you build that by, one, getting to know who your referring psychologists and treating and assessing psychologists are. How do they practice, and what are their beliefs about celibacy, discernment, and suitability? Be familiar with their psychological practices. Understand areas of their professional competence. Where else are they practicing, and with whom? Are they seeing seminarians in the process of formation so that they then have a new lens through which they're looking at the assessment process because they're seeing the problems throughout the formational lifespan? Understand the areas, therefore, of confidentiality and clearly articulate the profound differences in internal and external forum that is foreign territory for a psychologist, even in the terms. Obtain and discuss that consent completely with the applicant in both written and verbal forms. Follow the seminary formation policies and procedures if you have them, as we found out yesterday. And one of the things we'll be providing is really, sort of a sharing of each other's, email addresses so that you can continue to share information in that regard. The next slide is provide the more specific your referral questions to each specific assessment, the more information you will have and the more you gear the assessment process to that candidate and to your needs as an institute or seminary. Give over all of that assessment data and areas of concern as information, not as bias. Avoid vaguely worded referral questions. Well, tell me all you know about this candidate versus there seems to be a history of alcohol in the family. Could you assess that with this candidate? That's a very specific question versus a global question. Clarify that constantly and always go back to the vocation director or formator to clarify that. And ask for specific recommendations from the psychologist. In other words, using the assessment process that you've spent a lot of time and energy in for both short-term and long-term application in the informational process in an ongoing way.
Still on phase one, which is data collection, so once I get the referral questions from Jerry, the formator, I'm going to review those referral questions. And if I have any questions or any need for additional information, I'm going to call him or talk to him to clarify, those specific referral questions. And then I'm going to explain the assessment process to the candidate. And I may even talk to him about how this assessment or whatever I get from the assessment process, how those findings are going to be used in the admission process or probably in the formation process that is ongoing. And obviously, I'm going to review the candidate's previous history and any collateral data that I obtained from the seminary. And here, we also want to emphasize that we want to look beyond the referral questions and basically contextualize or see the candidate in the context of the seminary and the seminary formation process. We want to make sure that we have a global view and that we don't have this narrow focus just on the referral questions. And this will help us understand the complexity of the vocational experience and some of its specifics. For example, the relationship of the candidate to authority and to some of the seminary formators, and also some of the implications related to internal and external forum. All of this, as a psychologist, will help me develop some tentative hypothesis. And so once again, notice the very scientific, systematic way that I'm going to conduct the psychological evaluations. And if needed, I will go back for further clarification on the referral questions. I will conduct an extensive behavioral and clinical interview, and I will continue that hypothesis generating, making inferences, and so forth. Next slide.
We need to take a break. All right. Any questions and answers for the first part and part one? Yes. We're right on time, right on schedule, by the way.
Just a clarification on this last slide. It says review candidates' previous history and records. Say you have a candidate, I have one, who was transferring from a diocesan seminary to a religious community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been 6 years. He had psychological testing 6 years ago.
Right.
We heard during the course of the conference that those tests are valid for 2 years.
Right.
Do we ask that a candidate present those previous records?
Well, normally they wouldn't have them, first of all, because typically the diocese is the holder of the records themselves. The candidate might have a summary, but typically you would need, and I think this is canon law, whenever there's transfer from diocese to religious order or religious order to diocese, you get a report. You know, that's really part of that transfer process, and especially in light of everything in the charter, that's critical data you need to get. So in that, you will have all the data you really should have. It may have a summary of what the initial findings were, you know, in that typically, and also what was the candidate's engagement in this case in the diocesan system. But it won't be valid. In other words, you should not hold on to the, and you should not have access to, as you know, a psych assessment that is of limited utility after a period of time. You know, so you don't hold on to that, you know, a particular thing. But you do hold on to the sort of sense of these are areas that the person may want to attend to. Again, that's different than holding on to the assessment and its validity and its reliability. Does that help? Great. Steve.
Yes, this question goes back to, I think, Fernando.
It's not on.
Okay. I got to figure them out.
We'll repeat it.
Oh, thank you. I'll tell you. This question goes back to something I think Fernando had mentioned, and I think it has. You were talking at the time of the release form that the vocation director is getting, and you mentioned that the release form should include the type of testing. Could you tell me what you meant by that?
We're talking about some general components or sections of the consent form, and it is customary and best practices in any type of, you know, psychological assessment that we do, that we specify in there what are some of the instruments that are going to be used. Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, I was part of a team that was evaluating several people in San Diego, and we basically assessed, I would say, about 80 people from the community, and we had a consent form that was used, and we talked about how long the assessment process was going to take. We also talked about you know, the format of the instruments and so forth. A week later, we got a call from the mental health department in San Diego. There were 2 participants in that assessment you know, project that were complaining because we didn't specify the assessments that were going to be used. More specifically, they wanted to sue the research team because they said, for example, I answered an instrument that took about 2 hours and I didn't know about that. Furthermore, I answered an instrument that was extremely invasive. They were referring to the Rorschach and the thematic perception test. And I didn't have any foreknowledge about just what that entailed. I had a previous traumatic experience answering some of those instruments. And so what we are proposing is that we realize that sometimes candidates or members of the formation team may not be knowledgeable about some of these very technical instruments, but at least that we provide a general sense of what types of instruments they're going to be used. And we may avoid some of the technicalities referring to projectives or, you know, objectives and so forth, but at least give them a sense of what that is going to entail.
Could I make a... I'll react to that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the document for the vocation director's, you know, release of information. The vocation director doesn't necessarily know what tests are going to be given, because as part of the relational process, you may come across something that you want to probe a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
My experience is that vocation directors and formators, instead of asking and listing tests, are better at asking the questions that they want answered, and then maybe to say in the paragraph, describe objective and projective testing that will be used to answer these questions, and that in the release form that the person will also sign with the psychologist, that material, the test, be listed there.
Right, and what we're proposing as a model contradicts that. In other words, right, what we're saying is that informed consent is informed consent. And informed consent for the psychologist means the same thing for the vocation director, though it may look different. If I'm not preparing, and this is one of the criticisms that we've heard from candidates and that candidates have said to bishops, if I'm not preparing a candidate for the fact that you as the vocation director, me as the vocation director, am sending, you know, this candidate to him and you're going to be asked certain questions that are very, very private typically, and that, you know, will be kept private within the release, about family history, about sexuality, and that, you know, you'll be having these forms and it's going to take a specific amount of time. One of the key things in research that indicates that just as I give a client informed consent when they come into treatment that this might be painful, equally incumbent upon you as a vocation director, I believe, is the fact that this might cause discomfort.
Right.
For example, when I did my doctoral dissertation, I knew I was asking specific questions on sexuality. I had to write down that question in paper and in verbal form before any participant came in. They have a right not to answer, but
Absolutely.
They also have a right to be informed.
Absolutely. My suggestion is that is on the release form that is signed in the psychologist's office.
I agree.
Because here's the reason. I'll give you a case. Suppose we get a release for these particular things.
Right.
In the process of the ongoing conversation as part of the assessment,
Right.
it comes up that I have some issues with pornography and maybe a
Right.
pornography addiction. I've already signed what I'm going to release.
Right.
You can't now use some of the measures because you said this is what we're going to do.
Well, I think again, what we're suggesting in the vocational, you know, part of this is that you simply describe the measures that are going to be going on. You don't have to necessarily name the test.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Right.
But then if you're going to be fair and if you're going to be
Because he can do that.
That's my
Right,
point.
right.
It's not. I don't believe it belongs in the release form for the vocation director.
Right. What we're saying.
What may belong in there, and I'd like to suggest belong in there, would be the questions that we're providing to the provider.
Or types of questions and
Yeah.
areas of concern. That's,
Yeah.
I think, what we're talking about.
Yeah, we for example have I think it's 5 or 6
Right.
questions that we ask. That belongs in there.
Absolutely.
But the type of testing does not.
Okay. All right.
That's my opinion.
Great.
I'd like to respond to that somewhat from the psychological end. I think it might be a good idea if the psychologists formulate the language that could be inserted into
Right.
the assessment form that identifies the type of testing, personality testing,
Bingo.
intellectual testing,
Yes.
Right.
and that sort of thing.
That's right.
And then give that to the vocation directors, and maybe the vocation directors could also come up with a standard format for a release of information that everybody could agree to.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Many dioceses have that, and I think many dioceses have found that instead of just suggesting the type of testing, that it's good for a seminary or a diocese to come up with some questions that help the provider to be able to work around.
Oh no, I think again, notice what we're talking about is the dialogue. Notice what we just unsurfaced, I think is a great point. That clarifying exactly the words and terminology, but that the areas of testing, I think, and that you might feel uncomfortable, and again, anticipatory sort of anxiety often decreases anxiety when you then start talking about things. So we're going to have to take a break right now, so we'll be back after 5 minutes, and then maybe we can save those questions for later. Okay? Thanks. We'll be back at 5 after 10.
we were talking about the process by which I'm going to not only collect and review the information, but how I'm going to go about making psychological interpretations. And on this slide,
If I had it there.
referring to phase 2, it's actually back, slide 15.
There you go. Sorry.
I'm developing multiple inferences or interpretations that should be tentative. And I want to emphasize the tentativeness of these interpretations that I'm making. I'm referring to scores, I'm reviewing interview data, I'm also contrasting that to any seminary collateral data that I have obtained and any additional sources of data or information. And I'm going to be especially careful in order to have accurate, objective, and helpful psychological findings, that my interpretations or conclusions are not biased. And we have obtained a lot of very good research-founded insights from cognitive psychology about the various biases that might get into the inferential process as I'm doing the interpretations. For example, Jerry, as he was making the referral of this candidate, he was saying, wow, he went to Georgetown, he was Jesuit trained, he's really great, etc. One bias might be what we call in cognitive psychology the halo effect. If I form a very favorable impression of the candidate without really looking at the data. Another one might be a confirmatory bias, that if Jerry sort of influenced my impressions, I may select tests or come to conclusions that are going to confirm the impressions that I already formed, confirmatory bias, or that any events that have occurred 5-10 years ago through the collateral data are going to heavily influence or bias the very current information that I have obtained from the candidate, hindsight bias. Or in the case of a candidate who comes from an ethnically diverse background, as a psychologist, what are some of the ethnocentric or monocultural biases that are going to stereotypically influence the assessment process and the conclusions that I derive? There is a lot of cross-cultural and multicultural research and findings that we're hoping to address in the next conference that specifically is going to talk about some of these multicultural considerations. And remember, there is a lot of sources of information, a lot of data that is multi-method that I'm obtaining, and as a psychologist, I have to be very careful not to go by illusory correlations. If I see one finding here, and then I see another finding here, but maybe they're not correlated, so I always have to engage in that very critical process of discerning something that is accurate.
So too, if these are psychological principles, there might be vocational principles that show themselves in this particular framework that you need and we need to be aware of, because we will have those same biases, but now from the vocational or from the formational side. So it's really key for us to provide Fernando with as much objective data as possible, and for me as the vocation director, as the formator, to control how I have the halo effect, how I have the ways in which I might be confirming a bias about this person, or hindsight bias, or ethnocentricity, or illusory correlations. One of my great professors I had said, an illusory correlation is like this. I see a woman who cuts me off, then I make the correlation, all women are bad drivers. That's illusory correlation. The other key thing, I think, as vocation directors and particularly in formation committees, is the terrible process of groupthink. And we have to note that in the sense of, and what are going to be mechanisms that you can put in place in the devil advocate sort of role, where the ombudsman was created in social psychology or in organizations for that very reason. So the question would be, who's your ombudsman? Who's the one who's going to say, well, maybe it's that, maybe it's the bad, maybe it's the barrel, guys. Maybe it's not the fact that there are bad apples. Maybe, or what is it? So who's going to be your ombudsman in your own key sort of way of understanding groupthink?
Dr. Sperry talked about the fundamental attribution error that we often do, sometimes consciously or unconsciously, of overemphasizing the traits or dispositions of the candidate and not really accounting for any contextual or situational factors. And so in order for me to counter the fundamental attribution error, I may use a disconfirmation strategy. Look for information that might disprove or challenge some of those hypotheses and conclusions that I'm forming about the candidate. I may also delay reaching decisions while the assessment is conducted. Don't rush to judgments or conclusions, considering alternatives or something that might confirm or disconfirm some of those tentative findings, and always avoiding some of those cognitive biases that I previously explained. And since we have a lot of areas to assess, a lot of very important dimensions about the candidate's suitability for seminary, that I don't use a shotgun approach, but instead that I have adequate focus. And as I continue to elaborate some of these inferences and interpretations, what is going to be very helpful for the seminary formation team is that I provide them with general trends and patterns. Often the information is way too specific, and so they're going to be asking, what are some of the general patterns? And most importantly, that I elaborate on the specific, accurate, and objective behavioral descriptions about the candidate, and that I address the referral questions.
Well, this is our proposal to you today. What we're proposing is this new relational model, and you'll see the handout on the back of your handouts where we blow this slide up for you so to see, in order for you to see this a bit more. What we really are attempting to do here is not only pull together the data that you've been telling us, but really to look at the CARA data, to look at the document from the Vatican, to look at what Len Sperry is telling us and say, all right, what model, what operational model are we using right now that would help us contextualize what this information looks like? First and foremost, let's be really, really, really clear about this, that ultimately what we see here in this band right here is that we see the alpha and the omega, that it begins with the vocational call here, and that is the undergirding. That is the process that goes throughout all of these bands of both the foundational band here, the alpha band as we call it, the beta band, which is formation, and then the omega band, which is hopefully that integration phase on all of these four pillars that we put here, the human, spiritual, intellectual, and the pastoral. And that we see the choice, the grace, and the interpersonal variables here as really being the moderating variables to how the discernment on this particular aspect, this particular threshold of what we call, this particular theological, vocational threshold, and how that appears in all three bands. And notice what we do is how that often loops back to the omega point. In other words, that we come to conversion experiences often, don't we? We have that initial surge of vocational energy, and then it's tested and retested and comes back into and for different occasions. Sometimes it leads to holiness and wholeness. Sometimes, as we've talked about in this conference, it leads to sin or pathology, or both. In other words, they're not exclusionary sort of realities, but notice the interrelationship of it and notice the systemic nature of it. If we're looking at this as a system, which I think is a really key model for us to have in mind, it takes us away from that fundamental attributional error, which, by the way, the second part of the fundamental attributional error when you're in a relationship with another person, which is really key, is that if we're having a problem in the relationship, or if we're, having, a sort of difficulty, the first fundamental attributional error I make is, well, it's really because you're a bad person. The second is judgment of self. And where do you think we judge? Situational. And it's interesting. Well, I was having a bad day. Well, I did that because, I was stuck in traffic, or I had a doctor's appointment, or in other words, we typically make attributions of the other if I'm having a problem, but when that problem is a relational problem, I then attribute, that the situational factors that I'm having with the candidate, or with, a member of the seminary staff or something, that, oh, well, it's really just because, I was up late with Len and Fernando and I didn't have time to think about it. Where it's too quick, and that often happens in couples relationships, where you're blaming the individual, and that's what causes the anger and bitterness and real distrust. So too in seminary life, and so too in formational processes. We have to be extremely vigilant about that.
As a psychologist, you might be asking yourself, how is this model going to help me, especially right now as we're referring to phase 5 and we're doing the assessment and integrating the various findings about the candidate. How can this be helpful in my conceptualization and interpretation of the findings? As the formator, from a vocational perspective, has said that first, very important, the vocational experience is a multidimensional and very complex experience. In this case, symbolically represented as a journey that goes from the alpha to the omega point. And we have selected that terminology because, after all, once vocation calls for that transformation and ultimate union with Christ, it is a Christ-like experience. When I do assessment at the counseling center and I'm assessing for career or profession, I have a totally different conceptualization, a totally different interpretation of that career or professional experience. Your vocation as a priest or a calling as a candidate to the seminary is a call that comes from God. It has a fundamental theological grounding that is graced, and also that has all of these foundational thresholds. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And as the program for priestly formation highlights, there are biological, psychological, sociological, ecological, and interpersonal factors that are going to inform that vocational experience. We have titled that the alpha band. There is the root. There is the foundation of that is going to subsequently inform the the formation, which happens in an ecclesiastical and also evangelical context. The PPF document says that the formation takes place in an ecclesial context, and it is a radical call to live the gospel, evangelical. And you can see the 4 pillars that are human, spiritual, pastoral, and intellectual. And the priest, or the candidate to the priesthood, goes through those various phases and stages in life. That part includes some of the vocational insights that we have gotten from psychology. And we're hoping that this integration is going to lead to holiness or wholeness or sin or pathology. Hey, if there is no integration and there is a missing of the mark, that is the omega point, is that hopeless in that vocational experience? No. There is always a recursive journey to the alpha grace theological root or foundation of that calling, and we have included in there. And one final anthropological insight that we have derived from this relational model is that, as the forward pointed arrow indicates, the vocational journey is ongoing, developmental, continuous. The vocational experience is never, as the formator said, a fixed point that is static. It is not related to an epiphany conversion moment that happened 10 years ago and got fixed in time, but rather something that is graced, ongoing, developmental, and that as a psychologist, I may assess, for example, for the alpha band as the candidate is about to enter the seminary, and maybe reevaluation of some of those pillars of formation in the formation band. And as we have seen with the crisis of sexual abuse later, that we assess also the integration. Has this vocational experience led to holiness or wholeness, or to sin or pathology? And so we want to emphasize once again the longitudinal character of the vocational experience. Often as psychologists, we think that the vocational experience is sort of a cross-sectional experience, and we only assess for the foundation, but we want to highlight it is developmental, and it serves us well to capture that longitudinal reevaluation data that is obtained along the three bands.
And notice the title. I want you to stay here. Notice the title. It's a relational model that is dynamic. Those terms come out of Pastores Dabo Vobis. It is a full reflection of the image of God that is Trinitarian, Father, Son, and Spirit, one abiding in the other, and so too is our model, that each and every one of these is an abiding within, very rooted in our own anthropology. And it is dynamic, what Fernando's suggesting. If we don't go in that with those principles and presuppositions, we're going to lose that insight. And grace and sin and pathology must be clearly distinguished. That sometimes conversion does happen, and sometimes forgiveness heals a candidate. And we need to watch that. One of the key things, you know, that, and again, we have 28 pages on this model, so we're not going to bore you with that right now. You know, so the reality is, this is a possible template. We're putting that out there as sort of a summation of both the data we use from Kara and also that we would love to discuss with you. So again, it's a proposed model that we would love to get feedback on. So, one of the things on phase 6 in that sheet that we gave you are what are the situational variables. And remember yesterday when I made the point that in my observations of even what we had talked about, we really forgot about this. We were making in the process the fundamental attributional error, weren't we? And again, that is typical of what we will do. If anything we know in psychology, we know this. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So we will continue to make this error. What could we do differently? Well, let's look at Sam. I know you love to talk about Sam right now, since you love and adore this candidate at this point. What was the precipitating factor that got him into all the sort of realities that seem to be decompensating in the formational stage? It was the bullying in class. Notice how we immediately went to Sam's issues, Sam's problems, Sam's reality. Sam is this, Sam is that. We never asked the fundamental question, why? And we never asked a more simple question, what can we do differently? Notice the question. The responsibility for change is, of course, in the dialogue with Sam. What can we do, Sam, to help you? So you don't want to enable an individual, you do want to empower, but what about another simple solution to the system that might have changed it? You as dean, you as rector, you pull aside those who are bullying and say, this is not what we do if we image Christ. Period. What does that do then to Sam? Well, let's follow this. It lowers the perpetuating factors. It lowers his anxiety. It lowers his isolation. It lowers his symptom expression. It lowers what happens in that regard. It lowers most especially the stress he feels in the personality that he comes into. And the symptom reduction then, in conjunction with possibly then inviting him into pro-social behaviors, such as, gee, you're musically talented, why don't you start a group? Gee, you're musically inclined or chorally inclined, Why don't you involve other people from the local parish? So getting him out of the isolation, giving him an activity, and we know that the best way to increase self-esteem is through successful activity. And so that is perhaps a multi-method intervention. Notice what we keep using. Multi-method interventions, multi-method conceptualizations help us understand the situational factors much more.
Staying on task, we provided you with some of the research findings. As a psychologist, I follow some of the principles that are going to guide the process. I have a theoretical model that is based on a Catholic anthropology as I'm looking at this candidate's vocational experience. And I'm also very careful not to bias the various findings. And now we have come to phase 7. That is how I'm going to go about writing that report for you, formators. And so I'm going to be very careful in the way that I make my statements and conclusions. For example, if there are speculations based on the data, I'm going to be careful that the report is not over-speculative. And when there are speculations, that I qualify them and that I know that so that you can make some decisions that are based on accuracy. And let's see, something that I'm going to avoid is phrasing those statements or conclusions in a way that is overly dogmatic. I'm going to be tentative, and I'm going to avoid ambiguity because that is crucial for your decisions that you're going to make in the formation. Next slide. And let me give you one example. In the case of Sam, if I were to include a statement, Sam lacks social skills. Notice how general that is. That may actually be technically inaccurate because we must infer that Sam must have some social skills, although those skills may be inadequate. And so something that is going to be more informative and accurate is if I say that Sam has some social skills that are poorly developed or below average. So once again, the specificity. A statement, for example, that Sam uses socially inappropriate behavior may lead to all kinds of misinterpretations by the seminary formators. And so what we want to highlight is that when we as psychologists include some of those conclusions, that we anchor them in behavior. And for example, we include behavioral descriptors such as Sam frequently interrupts classes or meetings, or sometimes he engages in very tangential conversations. That is going to be more helpful. Furthermore, that I include explanations that are psychologically relevant and that they answer the referral questions and they avoid that ambiguity, that these are recommendations that are going to be key for the decisions that you make in formation, both short-term and long-term. And as you know, there is going to be a lot of conclusions. I'm going to avoid that sort of fragmentation, and I'm going to organize them in a coherent way, and that I also make them very actionable. The formation team needs from the psychologist conclusions that are going to have some practicality, and it's going to serve them well if I link them to behaviors, to therapeutic issues, and any additional needs that the applicant may have.
And one of the key points here that we want to make clear is that you as a psychologist need to know your role and boundary in that you're giving information and feedback and to step back about decisional statements. That, in other words, the vocation is the decision, and the decision for admission is the decision of the admission team and ultimately of the church. You're there as a collaborator, and to really know your role at this point is really critically sensitive and critically important information to keep in mind.
And obviously, when we look at the evidence that we have collected from the assessment and also the conclusions that are derived, they're going to vary depending on the evidence that I obtained. And so I may qualify some of those conclusions using language of conjecture. For example, say there seems to be a basis for this behavior, or there seems to be data suggesting this or that. And so once again, being tentative and qualifying, especially those statements that are speculative. And for those conclusions, when we have evidence that is more compelling and that is more objective, that I make statements that reflect that. So once again, we want to avoid improper emphasis or ambiguity. Next one. And we are going to be sensitive, especially to information overload, like what we are giving you today. And there's going to be a lot of details. So for one example of that information overloaded, sort of double, triple barrel statement, Sam's relative strengths are in abstract reasoning, general fund of knowledge. Let me take a breath. Short-term memory, attention span, and mathematical computation. It's overloaded. Instead, something that is going to be more helpful for the seminary is that I specify and maybe elaborate on every one of those dimensions that I included in that overloaded statement. And we come to phase 8. So once again, we're just guiding you through that process and how we are going to have collaboration to derive something that is helpful in terms of the assessment. Even the most secure of candidates might easily feel uneasy knowing that a report with a lot of highly confidential information is going to be used by decision makers in the seminary or people in power. I personally, as a seminarian, I remember going through that process, very anxiety-provoking. Consistent with the Catholic anthropology, we're sensitive, we're respectful of that, and so we may paraphrase, for example, some selected portions of the report as we give feedback to the candidate. We make it understandable for the candidate, being sensitive that sometimes we may overload the person with a lot of highly sensitive information. And that we take time to clarify any misconceptions or any misinterpretations of the assessment. And sometimes candidates fear that their sanity is being evaluated, that their psychological profile is being evaluated. And so we may take time to explain that, the essentials of the assessment. And here it is going to take clinical, professional, psychological judgment on my part. And just think about the diverse candidates that we get. And so when we provide feedback, be sensitive to the candidate's ego strength. He or she was subjected to 2 or 3 days of intense psychological assessment. His or her life situation. Someone mentioned, for example, when we have ethnically diverse candidates from Colombia, Mexico, or some of these countries, thinking that this psychological profile is the litmus test for admission into the seminary, and that this is going to be that crucial piece of evidence for admission or rejection, and they fear that this is going to send them back to their countries of origin, or whatever the life situation might be. Let's be sensitive to that, and especially to how receptive they are to the various findings that we have obtained.
One of the aspects I think that you see here now, we're going to be shifting, and we can breathe a little easier now that we sort of gotten to this point. We have plenty of time, and we're going to shift now a little bit. So we've basically taken you through that one sheet with the phases, right? Now I want to go back to the model that I proposed for you in that sheet. The original one, the 3 bands. Now we really want to take what we've sort of combined here in the formational band. So what does that look like as sort of formational sort of principles that we gleaned from what you told us this week? Does that make sense? Okay, you following this logic? Because now we sort of walked you through the assessment process, basic principles, basic phases of that sort of reality, and now we really want that reality to be almost a sort of entryway into, all right, what's the beauty and the challenges and obstacles now that this candidate in this process ought to be unfolding in the formational process of this individual. Notice what we're suggesting in our model is that there ought now to be perhaps much more dialogue with every player at the table, first and foremost. If you're abandoning the vocational eyes, and the vocational director, for example, is changing so rapidly as the data suggests, how often is that person included in the formational sort of system and decision-making process so that this person here knows what this person here is doing? If we're thinking in a systems way, perhaps we need to just simply do one systematic change. Invite your vocation director to your formational team meetings to listen to the ways in which you're processing information. So use the most appropriate and natural interventions first. Invite people to the table. That's Eucharistic. It's very Catholic. And it's very much about how you increase the dialogue and you get to know each other, don't you? Invite people to the table. There might be problems with that, but maybe, you know, again, occasionally. Not suggesting every conversation in formation team meetings, they don't need to be part of that. But at least when you have retreats or days or staff days, how often are you engaging in that? The first primary principle I think we need to go back to is really rooted in the documents that the Vatican really has given us. And Carlo Bresciani is actually known to our Irish friends here, and they often point to the reality of how much he really has been advocating, in his own way for the proper use of psychology. This is a good thing, folks. This document is really good news, essentially, that we have an enormous possibility here if we use it in the Roman way. If we use it with the sophistication and the nuance that is our church. That if we see it with the both and, of course there's always a Roman way. As the Archbishop, I think, was masterful in explaining the subtlety, the nuance of how we use this. Go back to that. First and foremost, let the candidate lead you. Let the spiritual direction be the first intervention. Your supervision, the regular and ongoing communication and meetings that you may have, let those interventions be natural, trust-filled, and the ways in which a relational ontology is fulfilled. Interventions might be with the person. They will be your least effective. The most effective interventions will be with the person and the system. Let me say that again. Your most effective interventions will be with the person and the system. Be creative in looking with simple, specific situational interventions. Don't rush to the personality deficiencies too easily. Or when you do, use what psychology is saying to us. Slow down. Breathe. Like what we're doing right now. We wanted to give you all that information to say, okay, what's the good news in all this that we learned this week? Recently, I was in a group that I run in California with the newly ordained, and the bishop, I think, had a wonderful question for the newly ordained. Several of whom, are typical of any newly ordained. What he revealed was, he said, I was down at our seminary and I was talking to a seminarian, and I asked him, how's it going? And the bishop revealed this wonderful statement and wisdom from the seminarian. And he said, Bishop, we're being formed in a formational system of entitlement. So the bishop posed the question to the newly ordained. Are you being formed in entitlement, or are you being formed in the gospel? How are we all buying into our own entitlement? Notice the question. It's a systemic question. How do we all buy into that? With limited resources in the world, we will buy into that. This is not something, that you can do on your own. Be very careful. I've already gotten some wonderful emails from people who've left here, and what do you think they wanted to do? They went right back and they immediately enacted the changes they thought they heard. And what do you think happened? They got lots of resistance immediately. Because one of the messages that we didn't clearly communicate is, in a relationship, you engage in a dialogue first. Please be careful about when you return. Please be careful about when you return. You're going to go out of here filled with new zeal. Let it be zeal in the image and likeness of our God, and not our entitlement that I have the answer. What are other formational principles? What are ways that we can have policies and procedures that should never be a surprise to the candidate? That's, I think, our overarching concern. And I think, Steve, that was our concern with how do we sort of invite the candidate into really knowing more about the testing process. I had a dear friend who did her whole dissertation on informed consent. And her basic hypothesis, which was found out and has been since verified in some really stunning data, is that we really need to be very sensitive to the fact that these people come to us from no informational sort of experience that we're used to, and no knowledge base. And it is our incumbent responsibility to lead them at every perspective, from every perspective, into the absolute confidence of what they're about to experience, and the absolute trust of that. And that, I think that's what, you can't possibly, for example, expect someone to go into therapy, for example, suddenly a year into formation if they never heard that that was an option in the beginning of formation. We all need information upon admission to any stage in our life. What information are you giving those to whom you are entrusted for their care? Watch and really be instruments of change, in just as I think the greatest grace of the sexual abuse crisis and the underreported grace of the sexual abuse crisis is that this church, this religious community, this body that has been so wounded by so much, has been at the forefront now of preventing sexual abuse in this country, and it shows. My brothers and sisters, we have a lot to be very grateful for and thankful for. But notice that it's the old Chinese symbol of crisis, that in everything there's opportunity and or chaos, rather. The symbol of chaos is that in every symbol of chaos or moment of chaos, there's both crisis and opportunity. And I think the opportunity is for all of us to become then educators of the candidate and the seminary and religious community. How much is the community and seminary itself understanding the proper use of psychology itself? Develop those appropriate policies and procedures, but don't reinvent the wheel. That's why we have each other. That's what you told us, and now we're going to look at more what you told us from yesterday.
We went through the assessment, the writing of the report, and the submission of those findings to the seminary team. My role as a psychologist doesn't end there. It is helpful and have as a template or a format that any findings or any observations are going to be seen sort of longitudinally. Some of those are going to have application in the formation process. And so yesterday during the conversation, you mentioned that some of the interventions or some of the various needs therapeutic can be conceptualized as falling into 4 phases, time sequence. Pre-admission, there are issues and needs that are going to be addressed pre-admission. Some of them are going to arise during the admission process itself. Some of them later during the various formation stages, and some of them are going to be unpredictable moments of crisis. During those various phases, both the formation team and the psychologist may intervene.
The other thing is you listed some issues that need, particular attention and particular care in both knowledge of the formation team, but also to be sensitive to and how they might occur. All the addictions, the sexual issues, the ability to understand the celibate lifestyle as a dynamic process, the issues of depression and anxiety that might occur from the situation and or with the individual, authority issues or interpersonal skills issues, that come into formation that might express themselves in anger issues. This key thing, and this is one of the things that Bishop Walsh, I really appreciated our conversations prior to the conference, was really, and this is again, this could be a whole conference, just like we could have a whole conference on psychosexual development and celibate development. How do we understand rigidity in the individual and dogmatism in the individual versus an allegiance to orthodoxy? And what are the markers within each? And I think we haven't really developed them yet, but I think they are something we need to address later. The key thing with transparency and authenticity, notice when we were talking about transparency and authenticity, we went right back to the individual, didn't we? That guy has to be more transparent. That woman needs to be more authentic. We were making the fundamental attributional error. Yet again, that does not mean he's not trying to present good. As a matter of fact, that's not a bad thing if you read the literature on social desirability. That a person in a highly influenced situation in which he knows he's being judged, that he is protecting himself, is actually a good sign of strength. Now, my question to you formators is this: how do you create a more transparent and authentic situation? How do we create a more authentic and transparent situation that avoids the extremes of clericalism or disloyalty? The key thing is, and I think this is perhaps one of the keys, and I'm not sure where this goes, but you raised the issue of the newly ordained yesterday. Where are we missing something in the system? If we're seeing this across the country, and we are, I could interview all the bishops and they would say yes, we're seeing it in the same percentages. Interviewing provincials, they're seeing it in the same percentages. Folks, we've got a problem. Something is wrong. It's not the individual. So perhaps what we're really talking about is a new proposed operational model that you put on the table yesterday. That you want to engage with the individual differently, using seminary resources, looking at the situation first, creating relational trust and partnership, consulting with the psychologist, not running to the psychologist right away, regular meetings with the formation team and referral psychologists, which then create what we hope would be a different feedback loop. And this is the key area there where we see the greatest deficiency that's in the CARA report. That if you are sending someone to therapy, how and in what ways are you respecting confidentiality? However, are you monitoring that the person's even going? And most especially because of our experience now with psychology and those outside of formation, is the person making progress? And is that progress substantial enough to proceed? So do you need regular progress reports that are non-invasive of the confidentiality? That indeed the person showed up. I know in several dioceses we do this on a regular basis when we have people in outpatient. We just simply give a very short summary. The person's shown up. Indeed, it is our opinion he's making progress. These are the goals, very clearly external form. And you can always update your psychologist. One of the things that someone reminded me of, and one of the things that when we were in the process of this study, is, and we were talking as Jesuits, saying, as Jesuits, we think, that, we have our act together, when in reality, I think, again, one of the reasons why I wanted Dawson and religious to come together is I think we all have bits of the answer, and our systems need to inform each other, right? Whereas in our Jesuit life, we don't have any model for ongoing formation. Oftentimes, we're not doing ongoing formation, because once we take final vows, our formation technically is done. That's not the model the Church is proposing. Likewise, on the other side, we have regular, in the Jesuit system, we have regular informaciones and ways in which we're constantly being reviewed in our formational process. One of the proposals I'd like to put forth is corporations have been doing 360 evaluations of their employees for years. That's all about executive leadership skills, strengths and weaknesses, how this person interacts with other individuals, what's the best fit of the individual in the corporate structure. That's easily translatable and external form. In other words, the company boss and the individual engage in a conversation in a very, very dynamic way as to how can we best use your talents. Final point. If we have the selection criteria in our seminaries and in formation that only a candidate we accept will only be a pastor, we have eliminated possibly good priests who would be great parochial vicars, educators, and spiritual directors. God thinks big. I plead with us that we have that same vision. Thank you. We now have 15 minutes of Q&A. If we could get the evaluation forms ready to be handed out. Psychologists, please raise your hands. I know some of you are leaving. Please feel free.
This is more of a suggestion or a comment on the relational model. One thing that's transformed my understanding and approach to formation has been understanding that the end point is not so much individual production of a priest, but at the entry of an individual into a broader community, the presbyterate, the religious community. I will often tell the seminarians, my aim in this is that when the bishop lays hands on you, you stop calling me Father Burns and you start calling me Mike. I have an investment in this formational process because this individual and all these individuals—
Psychologists, raise your hands. Sorry.
—become my brothers. And I think that it changes one's attitude. I think even for your model, I think it would help if it's truly relational, then the relationships continue. The relationship
absolutely.
Formation stops and the relationship brotherhood begins. I think that's an important thing. And if you know that, it's going to inform the way you do your formation as well.
Do you want to respond? Do you want to respond to that? Or you want me to say? Oh, no, I think that's again, I think that to me is the call and summons in Pastores Dabo Vobis, isn't it? When John Paul II says we have to figure out how we become a brotherhood of brothers. And I think that to me that's the necessary reform. If you want to be that blunt, and quite frankly, I do want to be that blunt. I think we're at a kairos moment in our church where we've been beaten and put down, and I think the phoenix is beginning to rise. I think priests nationally are beginning to recognize that 96% of us were not child molesters, that we need each other now. And I think there's something stirring in presbyterates all over the country that is really about claiming ourselves and claiming that beautiful image. You said that it really is an entrance into communion, not just of a spiritual nature, but that has concrete expression in the presbyterate. So thanks, Mike.
Jerry, just on that point there of the newly ordained, and I suppose the new challenges that they're facing and those percentages, that are quite alarming. Could you tell us about possible programs concrete forms in which that could take place after ordination, how you would approach a bishop, those kind of things in terms of trying to get something like that set up that isn't there in place already?
Well, I think, part of the question I think we really need to ask is how are we approaching the real elephant in the room, as everyone's been saying? How are we looking at sexuality, and how are we allowing folks, first of all, to get good information, about their bodies? I mean, as Len Levo at St. Luke's is famous for, when she came out of a conference with seminarians and said, they just don't even understand the basic plumbing. So part of it is basic information that we ought not to be afraid of. I think the whole theology of the body can be a wonderful way to integrate basic knowledge about who we are as sexual creatures, first and foremost. That we are gifts of God, that our bodies are gifts, and that we need to know that body intimately. That's part of that, human formation. If we don't claim that as Catholics, how possibly can we claim that as priests with our people? So that's the first angle of what I would say would be my first intervention. But my second really would be to go back to the seminarians to say, how can we have an environment and situation that is much more authentic and transparent? What can that conversation look like? And I don't think we have to violate internal and external form. As the Hope and Healing program has demonstrated throughout the religious communities this past year, we don't have templates for how to go from internal form conversation to then external form conversations that are so superficial. And there's a big range of conversations that can occur in here that are about supportive, authentic relationships that I have on a long-term basis that keep me honest. So what's the best prevention to avoid the problems we're seeing? I want to know when a candidate and whose information, who are they relating to, how well are they relating to them, and is it of a significant relational intimacy that keeps them secure in their priestly identity? That's a fundamental intimacy question, isn't it? Now, that reverses the whole preoccupation we had before with particular friendships. Nunquam duo semper tres was the Latin expression. Never two, always three, because of the fear of intimacy. The second component to sexuality is, name me one book that describes the models of affective celibate development in a normative, healthy way. Name me one book. It does not exist. In which it embraces vulnerability, weakness, sin, and pathology, and clearly distinguishes the three. In a 2,000-year history of our church, we can go back to the models of the saints. I can go back to Ignatius, but Ignatius and Augustine really lived rather dubious pre-assessment admission criteria. And I don't know if Ignatius or Augustine would ever make it through our process. Because Augustine clearly showed signs of addictive processes, didn't he, with his libations, and didn't Monica have sleepless nights? The models of the saints give us that. Paul gives us a model of celibacy. I think we have the models and we're not using them. So those are the three most important ways I think we can take that back to our bishops. Does that help? Sorry, I get kind of wound up on this one. Any other questions? We wore you out, didn't we? Well, this has been a wonderful conference. I can't thank you enough. And it's been a real honor and privilege considering your ultimate responsibility and ultimate care and service that you provide to the church, both within and outside the church in the sense of church structures. But we are all church, aren't we, in one deeper sense. We are all under that wonderful Gaudium et Spes image of who we are as the Church of Christ, regardless of church traditions. And I can't thank you enough for what you do for my love, which is the God I deeply am in love with, and the church I'm deeply in love with. So thank you for that. But I want to thank this colleague of mine. Do you understand where all the energy and all the sort of passion comes from? Is really this collaboration. And I think I want to first publicly thank Fernando for just his energy and his ability to synthesize this both before and during the conference. And so, Fernando, I want to thank you in a personal way for all your hard work. Again, we really need your feedback in the sense of, you know, what we can do differently in 2 years. God willing, we'll be able to hold this again. So anything and any suggestions you can spend the rest of the time with. We have about 7 minutes left before we would end this to fill those, you know, general evaluation forms out and get them back to us, and please leave them with Pat. And as you know, we go over them very seriously, and we take your feedback very seriously. So this is, again, just a great honor, pleasure to be with you. And let's go up and pray together one last time.